Someone You Should Know. A program about people you know, and even more that you don't. Hosted by Stuart Sax, veteran, husband, father, and grandfather. Now, here's your host, Stuart Sax.
Well, good morning and welcome to another edition of Someone You Should Know. Very, very glad that you've chosen this time and this day to drop in and say hello. So, hello. And we're going to have a good time today. We are brought to you today by our good friend, Christine Dean, who is the DFW Networking Diva. You know, we look at our websites almost every day. And sometimes it's a good idea to have another pair of eyes take a look at your website and see if maybe there's a little tweaking that can be done to make it even better than it is. That's what Christine Dean does better than anybody. Reach out to her, free consultation. If you need to set up a website, you need to revamp your website, you need to change information in your website. Christine Dean, the DFW Networking Diva.com, and I'll reach out to her. She's a wonderful lady, and she is the producer of this program. Thank you, Christine. Well, I have a very, very special guest that I met a while ago, and we kind of disconnected and reconnected. And lo and behold, I find out she's also a podcaster, and on a subject that has become actually just recently more meaningful to me. And we'll discuss a little bit about that. But my very, very special guest today is Kendra Rinaldi. And I welcome you to the show. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. It's good to see your smiling face and to have you on the show. Kendra is involved in an area that sometimes is very, very difficult for people. She is a podcaster and does a podcast called Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between. And we're going to talk quite a bit about grief, and then we'll talk about gratitude. But that gray in between is the part that really kind of, grabbed my attention. So welcome and thank you. And I guess first question is, when did you first decide to get involved in sharing, your interest and all as being like a grief coach for other people?
Well, first off, let me say hello and thank you so much for having me, Stuart, and for inviting me to be on your show and to talk about this topic, which I believe is important. And as you said, it has become something that we talk about more now. Thank goodness, because it is so taboo. It's become so taboo to really talk about death, illness, and grief, loss, any type. People lose their jobs. Sometimes they keep it hidden. They don't sometimes tell people that they've lost their job instead of reaching out and sharing and maybe networking. Or if they're going through a hard time with the illness, they keep it very private a lot of times too. And same thing then goes when they've experienced a death in their family and experience grief that comes from that. And again, grief can be experienced as well from these other life transitions that I just even mentioned before, like an illness, loss of a job, even just major life transitions, as even becoming a grandparent, as you are, could also bring some aspects of grief. No longer are you just your little nucleus family anymore of you, your kids. Now all of a sudden there's
Right,
more.
it's
And even
expanded.
it's expanded. And even though it's joyous, there still can be elements of grief in that composition. I know I experienced it when I became a mom myself, that it was a big life transition. I had to say goodbye to the me that was just me thinking of my own needs and my individuality to now of
You
others.
kinda you leave your comfort zone a little bit because, we all get used to doing things one way or in a certain groove, and then all of a sudden, something happens that forces you out of your comfort zone.
And anytime, yeah, you're absolutely right. Anything that's out of the comfort zone, out of your norm, can bring up feelings of grief. Any life change or transition can. I'm not saying for everybody that occurs, but moving is a big one too. When you moved, you leave behind something else, selling a home. I mean, there's just so many different things that can bring that. So, the reason I became interested in the topic of grief, and particularly in the area of accompanying people that have gone through loss, was because I experienced loss and death myself in my family nucleus. My sister died when I was 21. She died in a car accident. She was 18. That was in 1996. Yeah, I'm letting you all know how old I am by sharing the date. And then after that, I also experienced the loss of my first pregnancy. 10 years after my sister died. And then uh, 10 years after that, my mom died by pancreatic cancer. In between that, there were other losses associated with grief that was associated with death of other family members, friends, and such as well. So that
Do
was
do
my
you
personal correct.
Eh, do you find that sometimes, experiencing grief multiple times like you have, is it, like, cumulative? That obviously with the, tragic loss of your sister, and all, that's one kind of a grief. Certainly when someone is in their old age, and they've led a wonderful life and they simply pass away from natural causes, that's another kind of a grief, but maybe not as deep. But when you said that you lost your mom and you lost a child, do you find that sometimes a person might feel, why does this keep happening to me? What have I done to deserve this kind of grief over and over, like every so many years?
I think it can happen. I really think it's so individual how everybody experiences grief and what they believe that grief is, and that things like this occur to them if they think it's happening to them or if it's happening for them, right? I had a guest that lost both her limbs due to illness, and she had to have she was double amputee. And what helped her in her grief journey after losing her limbs was that shift of, it's not happening to me, it's happening for me. And in that shift of perspective, things like this that start happening, you don't feel like it's an attack of the world against you or of God or whatever your belief systems are. It is just a process and of life, of everything that is living goes through changes. And there is always like a shedding and a leaving behind. You think of, even a snake has to shed its skin every time it's going to grow new skin. So it's part of our process. So what you're saying relates to a lot of people. Yes, a lot of people do take that very personally, and like, okay, what is it? What is it that I've done that I have to do there? So what is it that I have to grow or learn that I'm experiencing all these things? And that that can be part of your process if you want to take it more into, what are my learnings and how can I grow from this experience, instead of getting stuck in the why. It's more like, what do I do now? That's a shift of perspective. So mindset and perspective make a huge difference into how different people handle different situations in their life. And past experiences build up a certain aspect of resilience as well as evidence in your own mind that you've already accomplished something before that you thought you were not going to be able to go through and kind of break through a really tough time in your life. When you've already had multiple things, it gives you proof and evidence that you will be able to overcome this as well.
I think that certainly there are books that have been written on how to deal with grief, but there is really no way to prepare for grief because it can hit us, as you said, from so many different ways and so many angles. It could be something. Look, we just went through a pandemic. There were a lot of people that lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they lost that source of income. They had to change their lives 180 degrees. That is something to grieve about. As you said at the top of the show, it doesn't necessarily have to be the death of a person, to put you into that grief mode. But, you know, do we as human beings have a difficult time dealing with grief? Uh, it's not a learned experience. It's something that happens sometimes just overnight. But are we underprepared for grieving?
I think that it's something that it still catches us by surprise. Like in terms of change, change is inevitable. Like that the moment we are conceived pretty much, we're already changing even in the womb, right? Change
Sure.
is happening constantly just in that human being, growing limbs, all this, then birth, all these changes. We grow, we go through we start walking, we do this. It's constant change, yet still when change comes it still catches us by surprise. So I don't know what it is about us as human beings that we are so surprised by change when it's something that's going to occur. We just don't know what, right? We don't know what's coming next. Like even the weather. I'm like, we live in the same city, you and I. It's like we had ice one week, then sun the other, and we're still like, what?
Yeah.
We're still
Right.
surprised and caught off guard. So I don't know the psyche behind it. I did not study psychology to really understand that part of us as human beings. It is intriguing as to why is it that we struggle so much with change when it's probably the most uh, assertive thing that's going to happen to it. Like it's going to happen. Change is going to happen, period. It's like a given.
Not only is going to happen, but virtually every 24 hours it happens because we are not factory workers. We don't get up and do exactly the same thing every day, day after day after day. So there is change. Uh, and we are underprepared, I think, for change. And then when that tragic situation happens and we have to deal with it, we often turn to others. For instance, in the case of a death in a family, very often people will turn to their clergy and all for some help and direction. And all they turn to a friend. In the case of terminal illnesses, they often turn to support groups to help them deal with their grief. Um, but again, I think the fact that you kind of consider yourself to be a grief counselor in order to
Coach. Yeah.
get people
Coach. Yeah.
a grief coach, yes, to be able to interact with people to say, I can help you get through this. Number one, because I've been there, and it's easy that I find it's a little difficult sometimes. I When somebody passes away, somebody else will say to them, I know how you feel. I don't think that anybody could know how everybody feels about a
Nope.
circumstance like that. You know, maybe a better thing to say would, I feel your pain, or I have shared where you are today, and all. But if you need me, I'm here to help. Because would you say that it is dangerous for people to try and grieve in private? That it's more important that they share their grief openly and publicly?
You touched on a couple of things. You mentioned community a lot, people reaching out to community when they're seeking for an answer of what it is they're going through. And I think with grief, I've interviewed actually most of the people I have on my podcast I actually, yeah, most of my podcasts are interviews. Let me just put it that way. So out of the 3 years I've been doing, maybe I've done 6 that are just me. The rest are all interviews. So
Okay.
and I put one out every week. So in those conversations, something that I've noticed that's a thread, it is for sure that people need an element of community and support, and that their grief needs to be witnessed in some shape or form. Something that also happens is that, and that I feel is that if we do not express our grief in some shape or form, again, everybody does not express it the same way. And that's sometimes also a little confusing, especially people in the same family. Like, how come Stuart went back to work when this happened and I'm still here in bed? Let's say your wife could say, like, I don't know, but that's just the way that you're doing it is by walking and, still continuing your life. That's the way you're grieving. Somebody might need to more retreat. So because it's so different, we tend to judge other people in their grief. But if we don't express it in some shape or form, again, it doesn't necessarily mean crying. It could just mean talking about it. It could be talking about your loved one. An analogy I use, it's like a pressure cooker. If you do not let the steam out little by little, the steam's in there. The steam is in there. It's just,
Right.
but if you do not let that steam out little by little throughout, it's going to have to come out somewhere. And it may come out in ways that you do not want it to come out. It could come out in illness. It could come out in anger, anger that you do not even know years later, that you may not know why this is all of a sudden here. So yes, expressing your grief is necessary for your own well-being and health.
Yeah, I think your analogy is absolutely perfect to use a pressure cooker, because if you let out that steam a little bit at a time, you're much better off than it building up and ultimately exploding. Because sometimes if that explosion of anger related to that grief, um, it can harm other people as well as yourself. Uh, and I think that maybe we have just kind of, especially maybe more so men than women, it's kind of this macho thing not to show your grief. I'm too strong to cry. I'm too strong to let this affect me. And over time, I think we have learned that probably the best thing to do in grieving is to let it out. Whether you let it out yourself or you let it out in the presence of a spouse or your family or other
Or go to
people.
support group or a support group. And I'll actually mention that if anybody listening to this is going through something, you can always look online. There are support groups you can join if by chance you're grieving. There are some specifically geared towards support groups that have to do with children. So you would go to childrengrieve.org. I believe that's the one of the things. The one that I was a volunteer here in the DFW area where we live is called Journey of Hope. That one has different support groups, and the link will be shared as well. Journey of Hope is a space that someone can go to be able to share the grief. They do have to have children in the program in order to do that. So there is that. Now, I want to talk about what you mentioned regarding the macho part of someone or that aspect. because for someone that is a parent like myself, we have a responsibility, or someone has children, grandkids, or is an educator, a responsibility to try to start shifting these ways in which we associate the aspect of vulnerability or sharing or anything, because it does create these problems later on as adults. So stop shaming your son if he falls and cries and calling them a baby or a girl, things like silly. Of course, girls cry too, boys cry too. It's like
Right.
those things of gender aspect that are so silly, as if, boys don't cry. That's not true. So we've
Yeah,
got
yeah,
to
or,
we've got to
that's what
say,
I say, yeah, the old phrase, "Real men don't cry." I
yeah,
mean,
no.
that's baloney.
Yeah, it's reframing all these perspectives that we have about gender, and it will shift the way of expressing as well. The other part too, and this goes back to what we were talking about before a little bit, of the aspect of creating resilience, is that when opportunities come in which you're able to go through a hard time with your family, let's say with your children, an animal dies in your family, and you hide the fact that your pet died, and you say that it just went to live in a farm, for example, you are taking away that opportunity of growth for your child, of experiencing grief already at that moment, and being able to walk them through that moment of heartbreak and pain. So please use any opportunity that you have. Don't try to minimize. Even let's say you had a trip planned and then it didn't end up happening. That aspect of going through, how do you call that? Sorry, Spanish is my first language, and sometimes I get tongue tied with words. Disappointment, dealing with disappointment. For example, how you navigate disappointment in yourself, but yourself first too, because that's how your children are watching. How do the adults in their life end up navigating disappointment? And then how you help them navigate disappointment is so important, because these are opportunities for them to learn that they are able to move through hard things. And again, it creates this little file cabinet of evidence in your mind that you've been able to overcome something before, so that when you are faced again with another big change in your life, you have somewhere in your brain to show, okay, I've done it before, I can do it now.
And it's mildly difficult for me to be carrying on this conversation with you, because as many, or I should say most of the people that are watching and listening to this program know, that we just lost our dear pet recently, within the last couple of weeks, to kidney disease, which progressed very, very rapidly. And our little pup is in a better place now, because she's out of pain and misery. And while I do feel a very deep sense of grief, the other part of what your podcast represents is the gratitude part. And I'll share for just a brief moment that while I was having a very difficult time accepting the fact that the best thing for our dog was to lay her to rest, I was so grateful that I surrounded ourselves with people that could deal with this, and I had that element of gratitude to say that they help, as well as my wife and family, helped me and us get through that process. Because to try and do all of this on your own is sometimes counterproductive. But uh, but when you have to deal with grief, I guess the question I would ask you is it better to do it with others than alone, easier to navigate.
First off, I send you love. I did not know about your pup, and my deepest really love sent to you in that,
Thank
being
you.
that I have two, and I know Christine as producer was saying she's got one too, and so I know that those things can be, even hearing someone else talk about their dog can also be
They're
hard at
family
times.
members.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, I've interviewed people that is the biggest loss they've had, has been the death of their pet, and the amount of, let me put it, they're probably, I have two, right? My day to day is probably more tied to them than anybody, than any other member of my family. So my day to day routine,
Right.
everything. So when a pet dies, it really, really shifts that routine of your day. It affects you so much. And they've been your companion in so many different times in your life. They might have been there when one of your children was born, or might have been there when you lost your job. You might have been there when so they are that continuous companion, and people probably don't give it the weight it needs to be given in grieving a family pet. So
Yeah,
first off,
and
that.
then when that element of your life is removed, you now look at things differently, and you have to readjust your routine. I just heard a statistic that is just terribly alarming. That it was about cancer, and it said that 50% of Americans will have to contend with some form of cancer in their life. 50%. Well, for anyone where cancer has touched your family, you know what it is. It's like to have to go through that process of watching someone deal with cancer and then ultimately maybe lose that battle. Uh, but a statistic that says that 50% of us will have to go through that. It's best to be prepared for that grieving process in advance. Uh, Sometimes it goes quickly, sometimes it's dragged out. That to me is the hardest part of the grief process, is that when someone has to deal with an illness long term.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, it's tough because and actually, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book, or the terms of the 5 stages of grief, that was actually more for terminally ill patients and themselves and their own stages of grief. So when, and imagine if it's longer, like it's it's like you're going through all that. Now,
yeah,
I didn't answer your other question before, regarding, because I wanted to make sure to acknowledge. And what was your dog's name?
Shayna.
Shayna. Okay. So I
Yeah.
wanted to just acknowledge Shayna and your loss before I answered the question regarding the part
Thank-
of accompaniment. So you mentioned that. I think it really just depends on a person. If someone tends to be a loner in general person, that a person tends to be more of a, yeah, alone, all of a sudden maybe being in groups might not be the right fit for them, right? But it might be the right fit for someone that's tends to be social. So it is, again, very individual to your personality as to how it is you might choose to surround yourself in grief. I interviewed someone for actually, I've interviewed several people of the Jewish faith in my podcast. And one of the things that in Judaism they do is hold Shiva right after someone's died. And that is somebody coming to your house every day for like 6 days, 7 days. So you are accompanied the whole time. And the reason for that is to make sure so for others to bear witness to your grief and for you to be accompanied. And something that I liked is that the people that are accompanying the griever have to take cues from the griever. So if the griever wants to talk, and so they have to wait to talk until the griever says something, if they and that way they can kind of
To open the
follow their
conversation.
cue. Yeah, they can follow their cue as to, oh, they want to talk about their person, or they want to talk about their loved one, and then go ahead and share stories, or they don't want to, or they want, they want to cry. Okay, then let me cry. Oh, they want to tell jokes, and that's the way they want to interact right now in their grief. Then let me do that. So by that, I want to say follow the cue of the griever as to how it is you're going to support them as well, if by chance you end up being someone that's supporting someone that's grieving.
Yeah, and because I think the opposite side of that can be devastating, because if someone locks themselves in their house to grieve on their own, that can lead to deep depression and even to suicide in some cases. We all know that in the military community, very often someone returning from service in the military has post they at the loss of their friends, they're grieving at whatever happened to them during their service, and instead of either they reaching out for help or someone else recognizing that this person, it may be a danger to themselves in their grief, uh, getting involved in that process is very, very important, to be that shoulder for somebody to lean on.
Yes, and you being a veteran yourself, correct?
Yes,
You're a veteran. So
yes.
Stuart, like for you, for example, when you came back from service, I interviewed a veteran, and it was that aspect too of maybe feeling so inadequate in this new reality after you've just been through something so hard. So being with others that have been through something similar than you, they might have not been in that same exact war or experience as you, but someone else that can relate to that reality of how inadequate you might feel in this place when your new normal was being on constant fight or flight type of mode, and all of a sudden you don't need to be feeling that way anymore when you're back. Like, how do you relate to those things? So yes, finding people that can relate to your experience is so helpful in order to prevent, like you said, some of these feelings of depression, suicidal thoughts, things like that, that sometimes people may have when they've experienced some trauma in their life. So, like it can be having been in war.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about the Journey of Hope grief support group, and I think that people need to understand that a support group is not there for the weak. It's really there for the strong. To realize that a support group can help you become stronger instead of you just continuing to to grieve on your own. Highly recommend. I mean, there are support groups for
For
everything.
everything. Oh, for everything. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, look, probably the most well known is Alcoholics Anonymous. They are a support group to help people who have a problem with alcohol. But the person who is an alcoholic must accept the fact that they are an alcoholic and then seek that help. The same thing with someone who is grieving the loss of a family member or so. You have to first say, hurt. Do I want to hurt alone, or do I want to reach out in order to help somebody, have somebody help me through this hurt?
Hmm. And not only in
Which
groups, then
then now bring.
sorry,
Go
it's
ahead.
cutting. No. You're cutting off a little bit on my end. I don't know. It's cutting off a little bit. So that's why I was
Okay.
interrupting. There, now I hear you. Go ahead.
Well, that kind of leads me into the other part of what your podcast is all about. You talk about grief and gratitude. and all that. Very, very often, and I've seen this myself. Once you've accepted the grieving process and you have reached out to someone else, it's that gratitude aspect that says, man, I couldn't have done this alone. I'm so thankful that I had somebody to help me. So that becomes that gray area in between the, on cast, which is grief, gratitude, and the gray between. I want you to explain a little bit more about how important that gray area is between grief and gratitude.
So the reason I titled it that way is because grief and gratitude seem these really opposing emotions, right? Like you put grief next to that word gratitude. What do you mean? I'm not grateful for experiencing this grief, or I'm not grateful for my person having died. That is not the point. That is not what I'm trying to say by the title of the podcast. That's why the gray in between is so important in the whole picture, because you cannot get to sometimes gratitude just like that, right? Now, if you create a gratitude practice in general in your life, that every day, regardless of what happens in your day, you already have a mindset of gratitude in your day to day, it helps immensely, even when you're going through hard times, to already have a way of looking in the world through lenses that see both the sadness and the pain and hardships that are occurring in the world, but is also able to filter out and see the beauty and the joy and the things that you can be grateful for as well. This comes again to that aspect of mindset and perspective, and how someone that's already developed these kind of tools, it does play a huge part in how they're going to navigate challenges in their life. So, one thing or gift or something you can add, a tool in your toolbox now, is already to start developing an attitude of gratitude, right, in your day to day, of seeing what can you be grateful for today now, so that in the future, in those days in which there is something hard that has happened, you are still working on this muscle of gratitude, and it changes your energy in your day to not just be stuck in the grief, when you already have a way of also looking at something else that brings joy and a smile to your face.
I think that's a very, very valid point that you bring up, Kendra, because, for instance, in my recent loss of my dog, I could spend a lot of time just grieving about the fact that she died of an illness that was irreversible, and I could agonize over that. But all of this happened within a matter of a few weeks. But I am so grateful for the 11 years that I had with her and all of those times that we had, that I think that it's a lesson that we can share with the people that are watching and listening, is that yes, there is grief when something tragic happens, but don't dwell on that. Remember that there is probably 20, 30, 50 more times of good thoughts that you have than there is in those last final moments.
Absolutely. And that shift in perspective makes it all that can happen even as you're observing, watching the news or things like that. Like, if you're stuck in only watching things that are showing you a world in which there is just so much pain, you forget to also then view the world in those moments of like, wow, a baby was born today and brought a smile to this person and this family's life. Uh, you know, uh, this bird just flew. I don't know. It's just, again, it's that, what are we feeding ourselves? And if you don't mind, I'll kind of lay into the part of how it is we even met, which was having these really meaningful conversations in a space that, in our case, it was online, in a place called Meaningful Conversations, an online meetup group. You can find it on Eventbrite in your areas too. But
Right.
it was a space in which we can talk about these topics that we may want to learn more about or hear other people's perspectives of different aspects and people's lives that might be challenging. And it could include even the beliefs about death or afterlife or things like that, that can just bring a different side to our life, in order to give us a perspective that's different than the one that maybe we've carried out through our life.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because I find that very often when you are in a group conversation like we do, uh, very often there's an aspect of the conversation that you never thought of. And all of a sudden it enlightens you and you say, I never thought about that, but it's absolutely right. And that is true in many support groups. You walk into that support group feeling very, very low. Then all of a sudden you share a conversation with other people who have it as bad or worse than you. And you walk out saying, I think I can deal with this a little bit better now, having shared that conversation.
Absolutely. Yes, it is. It is proof that there's something different too out there of other ways. Like, again, like how I learned about Shiva through somebody else's religious experiences of their grief. That for me was important. And to do that, we do have to be open minded in order to hear other people's perspectives and ideas they may have of their own life experiences, and then see how they may apply to our lives, and if they're able to be incorporated into our day to day in order to make our life richer and better in some shape or form. And if it comes in the aspect of, for example, with grief, if by chance the beliefs you might have about death that you grew up with, let's say believing about death, might be very scary and and maybe they just don't bring you comfort per se
Right.
in the what happens, maybe seek other beliefs that may be out there that can bring some comfort and solace to your soul in this process that you're grieving. You don't necessarily have to hold on to whatever it is you were brought up to believe. You can always seek to see if there's something else that might work for you now as an adult and for the person
Right.
you are now and what the experience you're going through now.
Or it's an added dimension to what you already are experiencing and learning. It gives another perspective, and every added perspective that you have to almost anything that we do in life makes us all stronger and better people. Uh, Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between.com. That is the website. I encourage you to go to the website, learn a little bit more about it and what Kendra is doing. Reach out to her. The email is there. You can reach out, and if you have questions, you want to learn more about meaningful conversations, you want to learn more about grief and grieving and the process. She's a lovely young lady, and it's not because you're just sitting here or that I know you personally, but I just think that you are very, very helpful to other people in what you're doing and with your podcasts. And again, go to the website and listen to some of the podcasts that she has, because you will walk away from it a better person for it.
And you will be a guest on mine too. So when people are
Yes.
listening to this, go check it out because we will have Stuart on my show as well, sharing his own perspective deeper now, and the tables will be turned. This was hard for me not to ask questions, by the way, as much, Stuart. I'm
That's right.
normally the question asker, not the answerer. So
And when I
thank
am the
you.
guest on your show, it's going to be difficult for me not to be asking the questions
That
also.
that's why I put mute sometimes too. I'm like, okay, let me. Thank you so much again for inviting me to talk about this, and again for people listening, find find things that spaces that you are able to hear other people's stories. Stories say a
Right.
lot, and you sharing your story means so much to someone else as well. So don't underestimate the power of your story. Your story matters, and your story will affect somebody else's life and make their life richer as well.
Absolutely. And again, I thank you very, very much for sharing your story with us. I always end my show by saying be yourself because everyone else is already taken. And that will do it for another edition of Someone You Should Know with my very, very special guest, Kendra Rinaldi. Thank you very much. Go out, make it a good day, and be good to each other.
Someone